People say that if you get lost in a blizzard, seeing a light means you've been saved. I used to believe that too. Until I stepped into that tent and found a cold-eyed man waiting with a blade. He wanted to throw me back out into the storm, and I had no idea that this seemingly wrong meeting would change my life forever. I don't remember how long I'd been walking through that white nothing. The steppe wind isn't like wind anywhere else I'd ever been. It doesn't blow, it tears, ripping through every layer of clothing, every layer of skin, until I couldn't be sure I was feeling anything at all. My hands had gone stiff inside my soaked gloves. My legs felt like they were dragging stones. My horse had left me an hour back, or I'd left it. I couldn't remember anymore. Memory does that when the cold gets bad enough. Then I saw the light. Yellow and small, swaying in the wind like it was about to go out, but there. I didn't stop to think. My legs ran toward it on their own, stumbling twice, falling once, getting up and running again. The tent flap had no latch. I pushed through. Warmth hit me in the face like a hand, warm, smelling of boiled butter and wood smoke, warm enough that I nearly cried with relief. Then I saw the knife, sharp, bright, pointed straight at the middle of my face, no more than a handspan away. I went very still. The person holding the knife was younger than I'd expected. A young man, tall, with the angular features of someone who'd grown up with steppe wind and sun. And he was watching me with narrowed eyes, like he was calculating exactly how much of a threat I was. Like he was looking at a wolf that had wandered into a sheep pen. I decided to smile. This was the tactic I used whenever I arrived somewhere unfamiliar and met strangers on my merchant travels. Smile first, ask questions later, don't make any sudden moves. I smiled as wide as I could manage, given that I was shaking from head to toe with cold. He didn't smile back, not at all. Not a single muscle moved in his face, not a flicker of anything changed in his eyes. Just the knife holding its position, and those eyes staying cold as the temperature outside. I remembered that I was standing at the entrance of a stranger's tent in the middle of a blizzard at midnight without knocking. I kept my smile in place. He kept his knife in place, and I realized this was going to be a very, very long night. "I'm lost," I said in Mandarin as slowly and clearly as I could. "The storm is too bad. I just need shelter for the night. I'll leave at first light." He looked at me. Nothing in his eyes told me whether he understood or not. Then he opened his mouth, and what came out was a string of sounds completely foreign to me, different rhythm, different stress, not a single syllable I could catch. I looked at him. He looked at me. We had reached a perfect linguistic deadlock. But when he stopped speaking and pointed straight at the tent entrance, that gesture needed no translation. Clear, firm, and carrying a very specific message, out. "Storm," I said, then pointed outside. "Very big storm." He pointed outside again. I pointed outside too. We both stood there pointing outside for a moment. The wind let out a long howl, as if to illustrate my argument. He lowered his arm, not because I'd convinced him, I assumed, but because his arm was tired. An elder appeared from behind a partition inside the tent, white-haired, white-bearded, eyes kind but sharp, looking at me, then at Zarin, then back at me with the expression of someone who had seen this exact situation unfold more than once. The two of them spoke in the tribal language for a while. Zarin didn't look pleased with how that conversation ended. The elder turned to me and said in slow but clear Mandarin, "Our law, we do not turn away guests in a storm. You may stay until it passes." I exhaled so hard I nearly sat down on the spot. Thank you so much." A sound beside me made me turn. Zarin had produced a blanket from somewhere, thin, worn, clearly a veteran of several winters, and thrown it straight at me without a word. I caught it on reflex. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. He turned his back, walked to his corner of the tent, lay down, pulled his own blanket up, and clearly declared that the conversation was over on his end. I looked at the thin blanket in my hands, looked at the corner of the tent the elder had pointed me toward, then looked at the blizzard outside. Still better than out there. I went to my corner. Warmth slowly came back into me as I sat by the fire. I looked around the tent, compact, everything in its place, tools hung on the crossbeams in a fixed order, every inch of space put to use, practical, I thought, but small. "Your tent is pretty small," I said. Not intentionally out loud, I just tend to say whatever I'm thinking. A lifelong habit. My mother always said it was a flaw. I'd never believed her until this exact moment. Zarin turned around slowly. He looked at me with an expression. I can't describe it precisely. I just know that if a person's gaze could physically throw someone out into a blizzard, that gaze was doing exactly that to me right now. I looked back at him. I looked around the tent. I looked back at him. I mean, cozy. I added, small but cozy. He held the look for 3 more seconds, then turned away. I sat quietly and told myself to think before I spoke next time. I knew I wouldn't. The fire in the tent was dying down, but still bright enough for me to see him. Zarin sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, slowly, steadily. Each stroke of the blade against the whetstone making a small, even sound like the ticking of a clock. I lay there looking up at the roof of the tent, trying to sleep, unable to sleep. The knife, the wind, the knife, the wind. "What are you sharpening your knife for?" I asked. He stopped, looked at me, looked at the knife, looked back at me, said nothing. I lay there looking back at him, waiting, then gradually realized that his gaze was answering my question in some way that I wasn't sure I wanted to understand more clearly. "Never mind," I said, "just asking." I pulled the blanket up to my chin, closed my eyes, and decided that the best question for tonight was no more questions at all. The sound of the knife started up again. I lay listening until I couldn't hear anything anymore. I woke up because of a smell. Not an unpleasant one, the opposite, rich and warm and fatty, the kind of smell that wakes your stomach before your brain has a chance to catch up. I sat up and looked down, a bowl of porridge sitting right beside where I'd been sleeping, still steaming. I looked around the tent. The elder was sitting on the other side drinking tea, watching me with a small smile but saying nothing. Zarin was standing near the tent entrance with his back to the inside, tying a saddle strap, with an unusual level of focus and concentration, enough that I suspected that strap might have been tied and untied at least 3 times since early morning. "Whose porridge is this?" I asked. The elder drank his tea. Zarin tied his strap. "I'm asking who made it." I tried again. The elder looked up at the ceiling of the tent. Zarin tied his strap with even more concentration. I looked at the bowl, looked at Zarin's back, looked at the bowl again. I decided to stop asking. The porridge was hot, rich, with something in it I couldn't identify but could eat. I finished it in complete silence and felt warm from the inside out. That morning, Zarin gestured for me to follow him. I followed. The yak herd stood in a cluster on the grazing ground, bigger than I remembered from yesterday, their long coats hanging almost to the ground, their breath coming out in white puffs in the cold air. Zarin pointed at a small wooden pail, pointed at the yak herd, made a milking gesture. I nodded, got it. I looked at the herd, looked at him, and asked with the clearest gestures I could manage, "Which ones are female?" He pointed. I nodded, picked up the pail, and walked toward the one he'd indicated. The yak stood still as I approached, which I took as a good sign. I sat down and started doing what I'd watched Zarin do that morning. The yak continued to stand still. I grew more confident. About 30 seconds later, something was clearly wrong. The yak began moving in a distinctly uncomfortable way, and when I looked down, I realized the problem. I looked up at Zarin. He was watching me with an expression, I don't know how to describe it, the kind of expression a person has when they're witnessing something unbelievable but don't want to believe it. "It's not a female, is it?" I asked in Mandarin, even though I knew he didn't understand. The male yak made a sound I had never heard before. Not quite a moo, not quite a bellow, but clearly not happy. The whole herd scattered in response. Zarin shouted something in the tribal language, probably run, since he was already running, dragging me by the arm as he went. We ran to the edge of the grazing ground and stopped behind a large rock. I bent over, hands on my knees, catching my breath. Zarin stood straight. He wasn't even winded, which was frankly excessive, and said something in the tribal language while looking in my direction. Calm voice, long. With the cadence of someone telling a story. "Did you just curse at me?" I wheezed. He looked at me, didn't deny it, didn't confirm it, just held my gaze for a moment, then turned back to watch the herd gradually settle down in the distance. "That was my first time," I said. "Anyone can make a mistake their first time." He didn't respond. I sighed. Is it that hard to tell the males and females apart? He looked at me, then at the herd, then back at me with the expression of someone who had just posed themselves a very large philosophical question. That afternoon I tried riding a yak. Zarin hadn't told me to. I climbed on myself, figuring I'd watched him do it all morning, that it couldn't be that different from a horse. And if I could ride a horse, I could ride a yak. The yak stood still. I stayed on. I was proud of myself. Zarin stood a few steps away, watching me with no particular expression. The yak stood there a few more seconds. I thought we'd reached a mutual understanding, then lowered its head, flicked it up in one clean motion, and I went off its back along a fairly elegant arc before landing on my full side in the mud. Silence. I lay there looking up at the gray sky, sat up. Looked at Zarin. He stood there looking down at me, silent, not coming closer, not asking if I was all right for exactly 3 seconds, then turned away. But I saw it. His shoulders shook just once, very small, very fast, right before he turned his back completely. I sat in the mud watching him walk away. I didn't know why I felt more amused than annoyed. I had dried noodles in my travel pack, the flat-pressed kind, just needing boiling water, the kind I always brought on long journeys. That evening I borrowed a small pot from the elder, boiled water, put the noodles in, added some of the seasoning I'd brought along. Nothing impressive, but it was all I could do. I poured 2 bowls and set one in front of Zarin. Try it, I said. Not as good as what you have here, but it's all right. He looked at the bowl for a moment, then picked up his chopsticks. 1 bite, chewed, swallowed, put the chopsticks down. Stood up, walked out of the tent, said nothing. I sat there looking at his bowl, still almost full, still steaming. The elder sat across from me drinking tea, watching me with an expression of wordless sympathy. Different tastes, I told myself, and picked up my own chopsticks. The noodles were still good. I finished my portion, stared at his portion for a moment, then ate that too, waste not. Elder, what's the chief's name? I asked the next morning. He looked at me and smiled. Zarin. What does it mean, compassion? I paused. Looked over at Zarin. He was standing beside the animal pen, glaring at a goat that was trying to squeeze through a gap in the fence, his expression capable of freezing boiling water. The goat got halfway through, looked at him, and decided against it. I looked back at the elder. The elder drank his tea. Makes sense, I said. The elder choked on his tea. That afternoon, I was sitting mending a loose thread on my sleeve when I realized I'd never actually called him by his name. Zarin was standing a few steps away, checking the lashing on some cargo. Zarin, I called. He turned around. I smiled and waved. No particular reason, just to see what would happen. He looked at me, looked at my waving hand, looked back at my face, then turned back to checking the cargo. I sat there analyzing that response. Yesterday, when I'd said his tent was small, he'd looked at me like he wanted to throw me into the blizzard. Just now, he'd only turned away, no glare, no knife-edge look, just turned away normally. I nodded to myself, progress. That night was colder than any night since I'd come into the tent. The fire was nearly out. I didn't know where the extra firewood was kept, and I lay curled up pulling the thin blanket up to my nose, still feeling the cold seeping in from every direction. It's so cold. I said, not meaning to say it out loud, it just came out. No one answered. Zarin was lying on the other side of the tent in silence. I thought he was already asleep. I closed my eyes, curled up tighter, tried to sleep. I woke in the morning noticeably warmer than the night before. I sat up and looked around. My blanket was still there, but beside where I'd been sleeping there was a neat stack of fresh firewood, and the fire in the tent was burning steadier and higher than it had been the night before. I looked over at Zarin. He'd gotten up before me and was now sitting tying his boots, back turned toward me. I looked at the firewood, looked at his back, decided not to ask. Thank you, I said. He didn't respond, but the movement of his hands paused for one beat. Day 4 and the storm still hadn't let up. I stood looking out the tent entrance, white in every direction, the wind howling, nothing visible beyond 10 paces, then sighed and turned back inside. I thought storms here cleared faster than this, I said, not talking to anyone in particular. You thought wrong. I went still, turned my head, Zarin was sitting mending his saddle, not looking up, his voice as casual as if he were commenting on the weather, which he was, in perfectly clear Mandarin with no reason for me to have misheard him. "You," I said slowly, "speak Mandarin." He didn't respond. From the beginning, still no response, still mending his saddle. "You've spoken Mandarin this whole time and said nothing." He looked up, held my gaze for a moment, then looked back down and kept mending. I stood there processing this for quite a long time. "So you understood everything I said over the past 4 days?" "Yes." "Including when I said your tent was small?" He didn't answer. I sat down, looked up at the ceiling, and realized that the past 4 days of my life needed to be completely reassessed. "Why?" I asked. Zarin didn't look up from the saddle he was mending. "Why didn't you speak Mandarin from the start?" "Didn't want to." I looked at him. He mended his saddle. "Didn't want to," I repeated. "Yes, you let me stand there gesturing like a mute for 4 days because you didn't want to." "You got your point across." "That's not the, it was funnier that way." I stopped. "You thought it was funny." He didn't answer, continued mending his saddle with a completely straight face. I sat there staring at him for a moment, processing the fact that this man, cold as ice, had sat there watching me gesture wildly for 4 days and found it amusing. "You know," I said finally, "I feel deceived." "You weren't deceived, you didn't ask." "I did ask." "I asked many things on the first day, in Mandarin." "I don't answer in Mandarin." "Because you didn't want to?" "Yes." I decided I was not going to win this argument. From the 5th day onward, meals in the tent became very different. Before, the silence was because we had no shared language. Now the silence was because we did have a shared language and both of us were using it. "I milked the right one today," I said. "Yes, 3 times slower than normal." "It was my first time, 5th time, first time I wasn't chased away." He looked at me. I looked back at him. "Fair enough," he said. "I helped myself to more food, pleased with myself." "But that's the gentlest one in the herd," he added. "Anyone could milk her." I put down my chopsticks. "Can you not let me have one good meal?" "I'm being honest." "Honesty doesn't have to be said out loud." He thought about this for a moment. "It does." Silence. I picked up my chopsticks and kept eating. He ate. The atmosphere was taut as a bowstring about to snap, but strangely, I didn't find it unpleasant. "Why do you talk so little?" I asked one evening, not trying to pick a fight, genuinely wanting to know. Zarin was looking into the fire, quiet long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Because most people aren't worth talking to." I nodded, letting that sit for a moment. "What about me?" He looked at me. "You talk enough for all of them." Is that a compliment or a criticism? An observation? Which way is it leaning? He held my gaze for one more second, then turned back to the fire. I waited, no further answer. "You know," I said, "people usually end a conversation by saying something, not by staring into a fire. People differ. You're people." "Yes, and I stare into fires." I sat there watching him watch the fire for a while, then I watched the fire too. Strangely, the silence this time wasn't as uncomfortable as I'd expected. "Today we practice riding," Zarin said the next morning. Not a suggestion, a declaration. I followed him out to the grazing ground, more confident than before because today I'd carefully observed how he mounted, how he kept his balance, how he steered. I climbed on. The yak stood still. I maintained my balance exactly as I'd observed. "This time it's going to work," I announced. Zarin stood beside me watching, saying nothing. The yak stood there 2 more seconds, then it threw me. Not hard, just a small roll of its shoulders, like someone shaking dust off a coat, but enough to send me on a brief airborne journey before landing squarely on my backside in yesterday's mud, which had not yet dried. Silence. I sat in the mud looking up. Zarin stood looking down at me, not actually checking a watch, but something in his expression was unmistakably that of a man who had been timing this in his head and was not surprised by the result. "Last time was longer," I said. "Yes," he said. 4 seconds. I brushed the mud off my hands, stood up, brushed off the rest. "How long did it take you to learn to ride a yak?" I asked. Zarin thought about it. 2 years old. I went still, processed that number. 2 years old, I repeated. "Yes, you knew how to ride a yak at the age of 2. "My father taught me." I looked at the yak, contentedly grazing as if nothing had happened. The yak looked back at me. We looked at each other for a moment. How long do you think it'll take me? I asked. Zarin looked at me, looked me over from head to foot, looked at the mud, looked back at me with the air of someone doing a very serious calculation. Longer. How much longer? Much longer. Can you give me a number? No. I looked at him. He turned and led the yak back to the pen. I stood there watching him go, looked down at the mud on my clothes, looked at the yak and decided I would try again tomorrow and prove him wrong. I knew I wouldn't prove him wrong, but I'd try. On day 8, I climbed onto a yak's back and it didn't throw me off immediately. Not because I'd done anything differently. Maybe this yak was in a good mood, I didn't know. I don't understand yak psychology, but it walked and I sat on it, and we made it one full lap around the grazing ground without incident. I yelled. Not because I meant to, it's just what a person's body does when they're too happy. The yak startled and stopped, but didn't throw me. I slid down and turned to find Zarin to show him, a natural reflex. The first person I wanted to show was the one who had watched me fall the most. He was standing a few steps away with his back to me, walking toward the animal pen. I watched the way he walked. Normally, Zarin walked very straight, very even, each step deliberate and sure, like someone who knows exactly where they're going and why. The walk right now was still straight, still even, but something about it was lighter, hard to say exactly, like someone who had just set something down without realizing they'd been carrying it. I stood there watching him go, hand still raised mid-wave. I lowered my hand, smiled to myself. That afternoon, the storm let up enough for me to stand outside the tent for a while. The steppe spread out in every direction, snow covering it all the way to the horizon, the sky low and gray but with patches where light broke through in pale yellow slants. Zarin was standing beside me, not invited, just there, as if this were something he did every afternoon and I happened to be standing in the same spot. This steppe is more beautiful than I expected, I said. The steppe doesn't need your opinion of it. I turned to look at him. He was still looking straight ahead. I meant it as a compliment. I know. Then, the steppe still doesn't need it. I stood there for a moment processing this logic. Do you ever just accept a compliment? He thought about it. No, why not? Because compliments are rarely simple. I looked out at the steppe, at the pale yellow light slowly fading. I didn't know why that sentence landed heavier than it seemed. A big storm was coming, the elder said so, reading the sky and the wind direction. Zarin had the whole tribe check and red-ighten the tent ropes. He called me over, pointed to the most complex knot at the corner of the tent and indicated I should learn it. What for? I asked. So if a storm comes, you can tie it yourself without calling for someone. I nodded. Made sense. He stood behind me, taking my hands to guide each movement. Left, loop back, pull down, hold tight, close enough that I could clearly hear his slow, even breathing right at the back of my neck. I looked at the knot, tried to focus on the knot. Left, he said. I looped the rope right, he adjusted my hands without comment. Then pull down. I pulled up. He exhaled, barely, almost inaudible, the kind of sound a person makes when they're trying not to let it be heard. I got the knot wrong for the third time. Sorry, I said. I'm focusing. He didn't respond, just undid it and started again from the beginning. Was that sigh because of me? I asked. No. Then why? The wind. I stopped what I was doing, looked around. The air was completely still, the kind of stillness that comes just before a big storm, not a blade of grass moving, not a single hair stirring. I turned back to look at him. He was looking at the half-finished knot, face expressionless. The wind, I repeated. Yes, the wind is completely still. It's about to come. You sighed because of wind that's about to come. Yes. I looked at him for a moment. He kept looking at the knot. All right, I said. Because of the wind. I turned back to the knot, this time genuinely trying to focus. Got it right. He said nothing, but his hands released mine and he stepped back, and I thought that was his way of saying good without using any words. That evening, I was rummaging through my pack for cold medicine. Several days of cold weather and my throat was starting to show signs of trouble. My travel pack has no real system. I shove things in wherever, so I had to pull out quite a few things before finding the medicine. The letter fell out when I wasn't paying attention. The sound of paper hitting the floor was small, but the tent was quiet. I picked it up quickly, tucked it back into an inner pocket, kept looking for the medicine as if nothing had happened. but I knew. The kind of knowing you get when someone is watching you, not staring, just the weight of someone's gaze pausing on something for a second. I didn't look up. Found the medicine, took it, packed everything back neatly. Zarin didn't ask. The evening continued as all evenings did. Fire, silence, the wind outside. I lay down and looked up at the ceiling. The letter was in the pocket against my chest, where I kept things that mattered most. For the first time since leaving home, it felt heavier than usual. The elder taught me every morning, about 15 minutes, sitting by the fire going through words one by one. The tribal language was harder than I'd expected, not in terms of vocabulary, but in terms of tones. The same sound spoken rising, falling, or level meant three completely different things. That afternoon, I saw Zarin sitting checking the bridles and decided to try. "Hey," I said in the tribal language, holding as carefully as I could to the tones the elder had shown me. "The weather is nice today." Zarin stopped what he was doing, looked at me. "You just said my yaks are fat." My mouth fell open. I was trying to say the weather is nice. "I know what you were trying to say, but you said my yaks are fat." "That's very different." He looked at me with the expression of someone deciding whether to answer that question. Very different. I looked out at the yak herd grazing in the distance. Though honestly, they are a little fat, aren't they? Zarin stood up, picked up the bridle, and walked into the pen. I thought I'd said the wrong thing again. The next morning, I started over from the beginning, this time paying closer attention to the tones. The elder was patient, speaking slowly, having me repeat, correcting little by little. That afternoon, I tried again. This time, I chose the simplest sentence I could manage, one I'd repeated in my head all morning until the tones were memorized. "Thank you," I said to Zarin in the tribal language. He stopped. A 1-second silence, not the silence of not wanting to answer, but the silence of someone who just heard something they hadn't expected. Then he turned and looked at me and without saying anything, opened his mouth and read the sentence back, slower, clearer. The tones a little more precise than what I'd just said, demonstrating. I repeated it after him. He gave a small nod, not praise, just confirmation. Then turned away and went back to work. I stood there watching him go, realizing he'd just done something no one had asked him to, no one had required of him, just because he wanted to. I wasn't sure Zarin knew that. To me, that was a big thing. The storm came at midnight. Not an ordinary storm, the tent shook with each gust like it was about to be uprooted. The wind howled without stopping. And outside there was nothing but darkness and white, indistinguishable. Zarin was up the moment it started. I didn't know if he'd been sleeping or just lying there waiting. He moved through the tent, checking every corner, every rope, every gap where wind might get in, his hands moving with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times. I sat up and watched him. "Is there anything I can do?" He stopped, didn't turn to look at me, just stopped, silent for a moment, as if calculating. "Sit still." I sat still. He kept checking 1 pass, 2 passes, until everything was secured, then finally sat down near the fire. Silence, only the storm outside. "Thank you," he said. Small, quiet, nearly swallowed by the wind, but I heard it clearly. I didn't ask what he was thanking me for sitting still or for something else. Just nodded and looked into the fire. The storm kept howling outside, and for the first time, I didn't find it frightening. I waited for a morning when the elder was sitting alone before I went to him. I sat down beside him, looked into my tea bowl, spent a moment thinking about how to ask, then decided to ask directly. "Elder, has anyone ever lived with the tribe more than 20 years ago?" He didn't answer immediately. His hands still held the tea bowl, but he wasn't drinking, just looking into it, quiet long enough for me to know the question had touched on something real. Then he looked up at me, longer than usual, the look of someone reading a face rather than just looking at it. "Why do you ask?" His voice was even, not guarded, not warmer or cooler than before, just genuinely asking and waiting. I looked back at him, thought of the letter in my chest pocket. Thought of my mother who had written it, who never spoke directly but had left enough between the lines for me to find. "I'm looking for someone," I said. The elder refilled my tea bowl, mine, not his, then began to speak, slowly, sentence by sentence, like someone lifting something from very deep and bringing it out into the light. There had been a handman. More than 20 years ago, in winter, lost in a storm and wandered into the tribe, like you," the elder said, and gave me a look that was hard to read. "He stayed 1 winter. He worked, learned the language, didn't complain. Then spring came, and one morning the elder woke to find him gone, no word, no trace, just a few small things left behind that he hadn't been able to carry." "You remember anything about him?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I expected. The elder looked at me. This time for a long while, looked at my eyes, looked down, looked at my eyes again. "His eyes looked like yours," he said, the sound of the fire, wind moving softly outside. I sat still, my fingers tightening slightly around the warm tea bowl, and said nothing more. I hadn't meant to tell him. It was just that the fire was burning evenly that evening. The storm had cleared since afternoon, and something about the air in the tent was strange, not tense, not cold, just quiet in a way that let people speak without it feeling odd. I started talking. About my mother, about the caravan, about a letter found after she died. Words that didn't say things straight out but gave me enough between the lines to understand that someone had left before I was old enough to remember his face. About this journey. About why I'd ended up on this particular stretch of steppe instead of taking the usual trade route. I told all of it, unfiltered, unsorted, just in the order it came to me. Zarin sat and listened, no interruptions, no questions, no change in expression. When I stopped because there was nothing left to say, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "What were you going to do if you found him?" I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it. I had walked how many days, crossed how many passes, gotten lost in a blizzard, and I had never once asked myself that question. I started. There was no next sentence. "I don't know anymore," I said, not the answer I'd wanted to give, but the most honest one I had. Zarin gave a small nod, not judging, not pitying, just the nod of someone who had heard what was said and accepted it. Then he got up, got more firewood, added it to the fire as if the evening was simply continuing as normal, no more questions. No commentary, no words of the kind people usually say when they've heard something sad. I sat looking at the fire, thinking about his question, thinking about my own answer. That night when I lay down, I realized Zarin wasn't turned away from me the way he usually was. He was lying on his back, looking up at the ceiling, breathing evenly. I didn't know if he knew he'd done it. I didn't ask. Just looked up at the ceiling too, and for the first time found I didn't need to have an answer by tonight. The next day I asked him, not to argue, not out of ordinary curiosity, just because I thought that if I'd told him everything about myself, it was fair to ask something about him. "Why do you hate outsiders?" Zarin didn't stop what he was doing, brushing his horse's mane. He kept brushing. "Because outsiders make promises and leave, straight. No hesitation, no circling, like the answer had been sitting at the tip of his tongue for a long time. "Who made you a promise?" I asked, following up. His hand stopped, 1 second, 2 seconds, kept brushing, no answer. I sat there watching him, watching that straight back and those steadily moving hands, and slowly came to understand that some questions don't lack an answer, just the right time. "Never mind," I said quietly, "just asking." He didn't respond. But his shoulders, which had tensed the moment I asked, released a little. I decided that was enough for today. The elder told me the next morning while Zarin was outside checking on the herd. His voice was even, unhurried, but each word carried a weight of its own. A merchant, Han, middle-aged, smooth-talking, smiled a lot. Came in autumn, said he wanted to establish a long-term trade arrangement, cloth, salt, in exchange for the tribe's wool and hides. Zarin had been 14 at the time, 1 year past losing his father, still learning how to carry things too heavy for a child's shoulders. He trusted that man. Completely, holding nothing back. That winter the tribe put out the majority of their stored goods under the agreement. Spring came. The merchant didn't return, the goods didn't return, not a single word, not a single reason. I sat and listened to the end, my hands lying on my knees with nowhere to go. The elder looked at me, said nothing more. Nothing more was needed. I went looking for Zarin that afternoon, not knowing what I meant to say, just knowing there was something that needed to be said, even if I couldn't yet see its shape. He was standing with his back to me, brushing the horse's mane. He heard my footsteps approaching and didn't turn, just paused a beat, then kept brushing. I stood beside him and opened my mouth. He spoke first, you know. Not a question. I closed my mouth, nodded, even though he wasn't looking at me. Yes, I said. He kept brushing the horse's mane. I stood beside him for a while, watching his hands move steadily, watching the horse stand quietly. There were many things I wanted to say, that I wasn't like that person, that I understood why he kept his distance, that I didn't blame him for any of it. But I thought Zarin had heard enough of what people say, so I said nothing more, just stood there beside him until the horse had been fully brushed. That evening I sat down beside Zarin at the fire, no asking, no announcing, just sat down as if the spot were mine. He didn't move away. I'm not like him, I said. Zarin didn't turn, his eyes still on the fire. I never said you were, but you're thinking it. Silence. No denial, no confirmation, just the silence of someone who'd been seen clearly and didn't want to acknowledge it. I know because I can read your face, I went on. He turned to look at me for the first time since the conversation started. There's nothing to read in my face. I looked straight back at him, didn't look away, looked at the set of his jaw, the way his shoulders were held slightly stiffer than usual, the way his eyes weren't quite as cold as he wanted them to be. There is, I said, you just don't know it. He held my gaze for another moment. Then turned back to the fire, said nothing more. I thought, for Zarin, not saying anything more was sometimes the closest he could come to admitting something. The storm came in late afternoon, this time bringing sleet and hail along with snow. The youngest yak, the smallest in the herd, born at the start of winter, was struck by a rolling stone from the slope beside the grazing ground and didn't get out of the way in time. Zarin found it when he went to check on the herd and carried it back to the tent in the middle of the storm. A wound on its front leg, tendon intact but badly swollen, the animal lying there breathing fast with wide open eyes. Zarin sat down beside it and went to work, cleaning the wound, splinting it, applying herbal poultice that the elder brought over. His hands were steady and careful, not a single unnecessary movement. I sat down on the other side, holding the lamp to keep the light up. I didn't know what else to do, didn't know how to treat a yak, didn't know how that poultice was used, didn't know if the injury was serious. But I didn't get up to sleep, just sat there holding the lamp, watching Zarin work in the small yellow light in the middle of the storm. Occasionally the young yak would stir, and Zarin would say something very quietly in the tribal language, not to me, to it. His voice that time was completely different from usual, soft in a way I had never heard from him. Light began coming slowly from the foot of the mountains. The young yak was still lying down, but its breathing had slowed and steadied, no longer the fast, labored panting of the night before. Zarin examined it one last time, laid his hand gently on its neck to feel. Then he breathed out. Long, slow, like someone releasing something they'd held all night. He leaned back, not falling, just letting go, letting his weight find somewhere to rest. His shoulder touched mine. I didn't move away. He didn't move away. We sat like that, shoulders together, watching the young yak sleep in the first light of morning. Outside, the storm had cleared at some point without us noticing, just a light breeze now, and the sound of snow melting and dripping off the roof. I don't know how long we sat like that. Nobody counted. Nobody needed to. When the sun was about a spear's height off the horizon, Zarin turned and looked at me. I was looking out the tent entrance, eyes heavy but not sleepy, that strange state of someone who's been awake all night but whose mind is still running. Are you tired? I turned to look at him, surprised enough to lose a second before answering. He had never asked that before, had never asked anything about me in that way. Tired, I said honestly, but I don't want to sleep. He didn't ask why. Didn't need to. Either he already knew the answer, or he understood that sometimes people don't want to explain things they can't even explain to themselves. He just reached over, picked up the butter tea flask, and poured more into my bowl. It had been empty for a while, held it out to me. I took it with both hands, feeling the warmth through the clay. Thank you, I said. He didn't respond. But this silence wasn't like the ones before, not cold, not distant, just the silence of two people sitting side by side with nothing left that needs to be said. That afternoon, the storm fully cleared and the sky opened up clear blue after so many days. I stood beside Zarin looking out at the steppe, thinking about the road ahead, about the caravan waiting for me, about the letter in my chest pocket. "The storm is over, I'll be leaving soon," I said. "How will you feel when I'm gone?" He didn't hesitate. "Quieter." I turned to look at him. "I'm asking seriously." "So am I." He was still looking straight ahead, face unchanged, voice completely level. I nodded, turned back to the step. "Quieter." A true answer, a reasonable one, not wrong in a single word. I talk a lot. I know I talk a lot. This tent would be considerably quieter without me. I knew all of that. And yet somehow that answer still stung a little, somewhere in my chest. Small, but there. I didn't say that out loud. Just stood looking at the step, let the wind hit my face, and wondered why I was standing here not wanting to leave. The elder called me over in the morning while Zarin hadn't yet come back from the herd. He sat down without speaking right away, just reached up to a small cloth bag hanging from the crossbeam, took something out and placed it in my hand. A leather bracelet. Old, worn in one spot, the bronze clasp gone dull with the years, but still intact. Someone had kept it carefully. "He left it behind before he went," the elder said. "I kept it because I didn't know what to do with it. Now I think I should give it to you." I looked at the bracelet in my palm. Remembered the letter from my mother, not all of it. Just a passage she'd written and rewritten as if she couldn't find the right way to say it directly. The leather bracelet he always wore, I can't quite remember what it looked like. I just remember he never took it off. I looked at the bronze clasp, looked at the worn spot, exactly where a person's skin touches most when worn for a long time. My fingers closed slowly around the bracelet. "Thank you," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I went outside and sat alone on a large rock beside the tent. The steppe after the storm was white and still, the low sun slanting across it and making the snow glitter in patches. Beautiful in the way that makes a person not know whether to look or look away. I opened my hand and looked at the bracelet. Didn't cry, not because I wasn't sad, but because it was a sadness without tears, the kind where you sit very still and feel something very heavy shifting around inside you. The sound of footsteps on snow. Zarin came and stood in front of me, looked at the bracelet in my hand, didn't ask. He sat down beside me on the rock, closer than the rock's size required, then took something from inside his coat, wrapped in a small piece of cloth and placed it in my other hand. I opened it. Dried flatbread, the kind the elder sometimes ate in the afternoon, lightly sweet, made from roasted barley and wild honey. I looked at the bread, looked at him. He looked out at the steppe, no explanation. "How did you know I was sad?" I asked. Zarin was still looking at the steppe. "Your face doesn't hide anything." I paused, looked at him. "You just used my own line on me." "That line is correct. When I said it, you told me your face had nothing to read." "My face is different." "How different?" "Nothing to read. Your face has too much." He turned to look at me for the first time since sitting down. "Different." I looked back at him, at the face he claimed had nothing to read, looked at his eyes, looked at the corner of his mouth, and I saw it. Small, very fast, the right corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, then returned to where it had been as if it had never happened. But it had, I saw it clearly. "You just smiled," I said. "No, I saw it. You imagined it. Your face has nothing to read and I still saw you smile." He turned back to look at the steppe. His ears were slightly red. I decided not to comment on that. That night I lay looking up at the ceiling, turning a question over in my mind until it stopped being a question and became an answer. My father hadn't been here, he'd come and gone, the way he'd done his whole life, or at least the part of his life I knew anything about. I'd found traces of him, found the bracelet, found someone who still remembered that his eyes looked like mine. Whether that was enough or not, I didn't know. But I knew one other thing more clearly: I didn't want to leave. The next morning I found Zarin while he was getting ready for the day's grazing. "I want to stay a little longer," I said. He didn't turn around immediately. "How long?" I thought about it. "I don't know yet." He kept arranging his things. I stood waiting, not explaining further, because the reason I wanted to stay wasn't something I could fit neatly into one sentence on one morning. Zarin didn't answer right away. He kept tying ropes, checking bags, finishing everything he'd already started. I stood waiting and began to think he might not answer at all, might treat the question as if it had never been asked. Then he stopped. Didn't turn to look at me, just stopped, was quiet, looked at something in front of him that I couldn't see, long enough that I breathed in, bracing myself for a refusal. "You still can't ride a yak." I blinked. "Who's going to clean the pen if you go?" I looked at him. He still hadn't turned, picking up his bag and putting it over his shoulder as if he'd just said the most ordinary thing that morning. "So that means," I started. "Don't ask again." I closed my mouth. Watched his back going outside, that straight posture and familiar stride, like every other morning. I stood alone in the tent and watched him go, trying not to smile, trying hard, genuinely trying and failing. I smiled to myself in the empty tent, and for the first time since leaving home, felt light in a way that was strange and wonderful. I sat down to write a letter one morning when the light was good enough to see the paper clearly. "To the caravan leader, I will be later than expected. Don't wait for me at the northern post. I am well." I sat looking at those 3 lines for a while. 3 lines for a decision that had taken a month of walking, a week of blizzards, 1 worn leather bracelet, and 1 man who didn't know how to smile to arrive at. I tried to write more. The reason is, I stopped. What was the reason? The reason was that I'd found traces of my father, but not my father, and that didn't hurt the way I'd thought it would. The reason was that someone had asked me a question I'd never thought to ask myself. The reason was that I wanted to stay until I could ride a yak without being thrown into the mud. I crossed out the unfinished line, folded the letter, gave it to the elder to send with whoever was going to the market fair next week. Some things have no words precise enough, and writing imprecisely is worse than not writing at all. From the day I stayed on, the evenings in the tent had one more regular thing. Zarin teaching me the tribal language, not the elder anymore. Zarin sitting across from me, saying a sentence, waiting for me to repeat it, correcting if I was wrong, moving to the next. More seriously than I'd expected, he didn't let small errors pass, didn't overlook tones that were off by even a little, didn't let me memorize without understanding meaning. I learned faster than I thought I could, perhaps because the teacher didn't allow slow learning. The first week, Zarin corrected me constantly, every 2 sentences. Something needed fixing. The second week, less. The third week, there were sessions where I spoke whole passages and he just listened, not interrupting. He never praised me. But the gap between the end of my sentences and the moment he opened his mouth to correct kept growing longer. And I decided that was a more reliable measure than any praise. On the 18th evening of language lessons, I tried the most complex sentence yet. A question about tomorrow's weather with enough tonal complexity, enough structure that the elder had said beginners usually got wrong. I finished saying it. Zarin looked at me. 2 seconds of silence, not the silence of thinking about how to correct something. I had learned the difference between his 2 kinds of silence by now. Good, 1 word. I sat there looking at him. That's all. Yes, nothing to correct, nothing to correct. I watched him for another moment, waiting to see if there was more. There wasn't. He reached over, poured tea into his bowl, drank, and looked into the fire as if the evening was continuing as normal. I sat in that silence, looking into the fire too, and realized that 1 word from Zarin was making me happier than a paragraph of praise from anyone else I'd ever known. I didn't say that out loud, but he probably knew, because my face doesn't hide anything. One evening, I asked him directly, not to start something, just a question that had been sitting in my head long enough that it needed to come out. "What do you think of me?" Zarin looked at me. Didn't ask me to repeat it, didn't deflect, just looked at me the way he looked when he was genuinely thinking, not just waiting for a conversation to end, quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer, a nuisance. I nodded, but not the kind I want to get rid of. I looked at him. Those are 2 different things, very different. I sat with that answer for a moment, turned it over, looked at it from all sides, checked for any place where he might be circling around something. There wasn't with Zarin. What he said was what he meant, nothing added, nothing left out. "All right," I said, "I'll take it." He turned back to the fire. "You don't have another choice." "No, I don't." We sat in silence, and this time the silence was warmer than I remembered it ever being. George, a 20-year-old in the tribe, always smiling, always teasing me about the yak riding, fell off his horse that morning and badly sprained his left wrist. The elder was somewhere else. I was the nearest person. I don't know much about medicine, but sprains I know. You get several of those on any merchant journey. I wrapped George's wrist, immobilized it, told him not to use it for 3 days. He thanked me. I waved it off. When I turned around, I found Zarin standing a few steps away, looking in my direction, not at George, at me. I waved. He turned away. That evening, nothing was different. Dinner, language practice, sitting by the fire. But when my tea bowl was nearly empty before I could reach for the flask, Zarin had already refilled it, without looking at me, without saying anything, set the flask back down, kept looking into the fire as if nothing had happened. I looked at the full bowl, looked at him, looked back at the bowl. Drank a sip, said nothing. Some things once said are lost. Left alone, they last. One evening, the elder gathered everyone in the tribe to sit around the big fire, no particular reason. Just that sometimes people need to sit together. I told a story from the previous year's merchant journey, the time our caravan accidentally bought a whole cartload of indigo-dyed cloth where the dye hadn't been set. And by the time it rained, all 10 of us walking out on the road had turned blue from head to foot. And the locals thought they'd seen ghosts and ran screaming. The elder laughed first, then others joined in, laughter going around the fire, warm in a way different from the heat of the flames. I glanced over at Zarin. He was sitting beside me, face straight as always, but his eyes weren't straight like his face. Something in his eyes was different, small, like firelight landing in a spot that was usually dark. I turned back to everyone else, casual. "Oh, and there's one more thing," I said. "There's something even better from that trip." I kept going, not because that story was actually better, but because I wanted to see if that something in Zarin's eyes was still there. It was. On the walk back to the tent, I fell in beside him and asked directly, "Have you never laughed?" "I have." I turned to look at him. "I've never seen it." "Because you've never said anything worth laughing at." I stopped. He walked 2 more steps, then stopped too, turning back to look at me. "Tonight I told a story about the whole caravan turning into blue ghosts, and you didn't find that funny?" "A little funny." "A little." "Yes. So how funny does something have to be before you laugh?" He genuinely thought about this. I could tell he was genuinely thinking because his eyes lifted slightly in the way of someone looking something up inside their own head. "I don't know," he said finally. "It's been a long time since I tried." Then he went inside. I stood out there alone under a sky full of stars, turning that sentence over in my head. It's been a long time since I tried. I spent the whole next afternoon thinking of new stories, not to win anything, but because that sentence sounded sadder than it appeared. Spring came quietly. One morning I woke to find the snow on the tent roof thinner than the day before, and something in the wind had changed from what it had been for the past 2 months, no longer just cold, but with something wet and green underneath the cold. The tribe began to prepare. I didn't know this was something they did every year until I saw everyone starting to pack, check supplies, talk over the route, the spring grazing ground to the northeast, 2 days' journey if the weather held. That afternoon, Zarin came and stood beside me while I was looking out at the steppe. Not looking at me, looking straight ahead, voice as casual as if he were asking about the weather. "Are you coming with us or going home?" I went still. A simple question, clear, no circling, 2 choices, no third option. I looked out at the steppe, snow melting in the patches where the sun hit, revealing the yellow-brown of winter grass waiting to turn green. "Can I not answer right away?" I asked. "You can," he said, "but the caravan leaves the day after tomorrow." That night I went to find him. "What do you want me to do?" Zarin looked at me, not a surprised look, not an evasive one, just looked quiet for longer than usual. Long enough that I started to think I'd phrased it wrong. Then he looked out at the steppe. A stupid question. I waited. "Why stupid?" "Because you already know the answer." I stood there watching him watch the steppe, watching his straight, steady silhouette in the darkening sky. "You already know the answer." I turned that sentence over in my head. He said I already knew, but did he know? Did he know his own answer, or was he also just standing here unable to name what it was? I looked at him. He kept looking at the steppe. "All right," I said finally. "Then I know." He didn't ask what I knew. I thought he knew too. The night before the caravan moved, Outside the tent came the sounds of people walking, of things being tied down, of animals being soothed. I lay listening, unable to sleep. Zarin was sitting by the fire as he did every night. I never knew if he slept enough, or if he'd simply grown used to being the last one awake on every night this tribe had. "Are you scared?" I asked. He didn't turn around. "Of what?" "Of me leaving." Silence. Longer than any silence before, long enough that I could count the cracks of wood in the fire, count my own breaths. "No," I watched his back. "You're lying." He didn't turn around, didn't argue. Didn't deny it again, just sat there looking into the fire, shoulders straight, breathing even, quiet in the way of someone who knows they've been seen through and no longer has the energy to build another wall. I lay looking up at the ceiling. Outside, the sounds of preparation went on. Inside, the fire burned steadily. I closed my eyes and for the first time that night, felt I could sleep. I was up before full daylight. I found Zarin where he usually stood in the mornings, beside the animal pen, doing a final check before the journey. "I want to come with you," I said, no explanation. No reasons, no conditions, just that straight and clean, the way I'd learned from him over 2 months of living together. Zarin looked at me, long enough for me to see his eyes clearly, not cold, not distant, just looking the way a person looks at something real. Then he turned to the elder who was standing nearby and said something in the tribal language, his voice even. The elder listened, looked at me, and smiled, the smile of someone who had known something for a long time and had just been confirmed. "He just asked for an extra yak for you to ride." The elder said. I looked at Zarin. He had already turned back to checking the tie-down ropes, his back to me, as if the matter had been settled on his end, but his ears were red. I looked at those ears for a moment, then decided this was not the moment to say anything more. "Thank you," I said to the elder. The elder drank his tea and smiled. I was packing my personal things into my bag when I heard footsteps entering the tent. Zarin. He didn't look at me, walked straight to a corner of the tent, took something folded from there, turned and threw it squarely into my hands. A sheepskin coat. Thick, heavy, the natural earth brown of undyed wool. The kind I'd seen people in the tribe wearing on long journeys out, cut close from the collar down to near the knee, warm enough for 2 days of travel across a windswept steppe. I held it in my hands and looked at him. He offered no explanation, said nothing about what it was, said nothing about what I should do with it, said nothing at all, just threw it and turned away, walked straight back out of the tent into the morning outside as if he'd never come in. I stood holding the coat, listening to his footsteps fade, looked down at it. The wool was still soft, the stitching straight and solid. I put it on. It fit like it had been made for someone with the same broad shoulders as mine. The elder looked up when I put the coat on and smiled immediately, a smile that broke through on its own before he could hold it back. "What is it?" I asked. He looked at me a moment longer with the look of someone weighing whether to say something, then decided to say it. "Zarin made that coat last year," he said. "For himself, he never wore it once." I went still, looked down at the coat on my body, made for himself, meaning it was his size, and Zarin and I had the same broad shoulders, nearly the same height, so it fit me as if it had been made for me. Never wore it once, meaning he'd kept it there. Kept a coat he'd never worn for a whole year, and this morning taken it out and thrown it at me without a word. I stood looking down at the coat, at the stitching he had done with his own hands, straight and solid. The feeling in my chest at that moment had no precise name. I only knew it was warm and heavy, and not something I wanted to say out loud in the middle of this morning. "Don't tell him I know," I said. The elder drank his tea. "I won't say a word." The caravan set out when the sun had just cleared the eastern peaks. People, horses, yaks, belongings, everything moving out onto the steppe in the familiar order of a tribe that had done this for hundreds of years, knowing where they were going and how without anyone needing to call out. The extra yak they'd gotten for me was the second gentlest in the herd. I checked carefully before climbing on, took it slow, held my balance the way Zarin had taught me. The yak stood still, walked. I sat on it, riding beside Zarin, who was on horseback at a slow pace leading a small group, and I didn't fall off. 1 loop, 2 loops. The steppe opened out on both sides, snow melting to reveal the first pale green of spring grass underneath. Zarin glanced over at me, a quick look, checking, the way someone leading a group glances back to see if those behind are keeping up. I smiled. He turned back to look straight ahead. But this time I saw it clearly, not firelight landing in a dark place, not a corner of a mouth twitching and pulling back, not something I had to strain to catch. This time it was a real smile, small, very fast. But there, and I saw it. And this time I said nothing because some things, once named, are gone. The spring step is something I have no words for. Not because it isn't beautiful enough that you stand there and forget you're standing. Forget you're breathing. Forget everything except the green that stretches out in every direction to the very edge of the world. Zarin rode ahead, scouting, checking terrain, the work of a leader. I rode my yak behind slower, some distance from the main group. Then I saw him stop. On the crest of a small rise, horse still, sitting up there looking out ahead, not turning his head back, not calling out, not making any signal, just stopping and waiting. I rode my yak up to where he was and stopped beside him. 2 people, 2 animals, a small rise in the middle of a spring step green enough to hurt your eyes. It really is beautiful, I said. He didn't respond. But he didn't ride on, just sat there, shoulder beside my shoulder, looking ahead. I looked out at the step and thought of my father. Not the image of my father standing somewhere ahead waiting for me, but the leather bracelet in my chest pocket. The eyes the elder said looked like mine, the person who had come here and gone without leaving a word. I no longer wanted to chase after him, not because I'd given up, but because for the first time I understood that some things people search for their whole lives without knowing their shape, then one day look back and find they've had it all along without knowing when. Zarin rode on ahead. I nudged my yak forward and followed, and I realized my father hadn't been here, this journey hadn't found the person I'd set out to find, and that no longer hurt the way I had thought it would, because I had found something else. The first person in my life who waited for me without needing me to ask, who didn't need me to explain why I was slow, who didn't need me to be anything other than someone riding a yak slowly across a spring step, wearing a sheepskin coat that had never been worn, following someone who was waiting. The step spread green in every direction. I rode on. Some meetings seem like they'll last only one night, but turn out to be enough to change a whole life. In the cold of a blizzard, one person found shelter. And in the silence of a man who didn't know how to speak with tenderness, something grew, a love more enduring than any promise. Perhaps love doesn't always begin with sweet words. Sometimes it begins with being allowed to stay with a bowl of hot porridge, with someone who quietly cares for you without ever saying so. But if it were you? Between someone who always speaks every feeling out loud and someone who can only show love through quiet action, which kind would you choose? And why?